Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Wojciech Szczerba. I'm a rector, president of Evangelical School of Theology in Wroclaw, Poland. And it is my honor, my pleasure to lead a series of interviews entitled Christianity in the Age of Anxiety. In our ecumenical approach, we believe that theology should be done in a dialogue which crosses doctrinal boundaries and divisions, and which honors the other person. So we ask questions and we learn from various people of faith and wisdom. And in this series, we are referring to the fundamental matter of the meaning of Christianity in the contemporary world. And particularly, we're thinking of the context of pandemic or pandemics, which we are facing today. So Christianity in the age of anxiety. And this is my pleasure to introduce our special guest today. With us today, there is Dr. Edgardo Colón-Emeric, welcome, and Dr. David Emmanuel Goatley. Thank you for inviting the invitation. And let me say a few words about you so that our students and our Polish public would know you better. So Dr. Edgardo Colón-Emeric is a director of Center for Reconciliation at Duke Divinity School since 2018. Is this right?
That is correct.
Wonderful. He directs the Central American Methodist course of study and the Peru Theological Initiative. He serves in the United Methodist Committee of Faith and Order, and he's ordained elder in the North Carolina Annual Conference. And as far as I know, Dr. Edgardo Colón-Emeric is ecumenist at heart. In his teaching, in his publishing, in his practice. He explores the intersection of various theologies, especially the Methodist and Catholic theology. And he's author and editor of many publications. Among them, there is the awarded Wesley, Aquinas, and Christian Perfection and Ecumenical Dialogue, and also more recent book, Oscar Romero's Theological Vision, Liberation and the Transfiguration of the Poor. This is 2018. These are very interesting books. Thank you very much. And I really have to say that the Center for Reconciliation is a really important place for Christianity today. It is an important place for me. I remember the first time I visited Center for Reconciliation years ago, I thought it was heaven. And nothing has changed since then. I still think it's heaven. The Summer Institute, the courses, the people, the atmosphere, it's a beautiful initiative and very important, really. And the goal to form and support leaders, communities, and congregations as ambassadors of reconciliation, I think it's a very important mission today. So thank you very much for everything what you do.
Thank you very much.
And then there is Dr. David Emmanuel Goatley, who is the research professor of theology and Black Church Studies at Duke Divinity School. Welcome. He's a director of Office of Black Church Studies. And in his scholarship and his practice, he also deals with the intersection of missiology, Black theology, and leadership strategy. As far as I understand, in your missiological attitude, you really emphasize the importance of cross-cultural learning with indigenous communities, and I like it very much. It's really a wonderful perspective. You're ordained in National Baptist Convention, and Dr. Goatley is an editor of the publication of Black Religion, Black Theology, Collected Essays of J. Diotis Roberts. It's an important publication, precedential really publication. And then he's also an author of a number of articles and books. Among them, there is this book, Were You There? God-Forsakenness, Enslaved Religion, A Divine Assignment, The Missiology of Wendell Clay Somerville, and Mission is Essential. Thank you very much for these fascinating and important publications.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Gentlemen, it's my honor, really. So I have for you this very simple question. And let me start with a simple question. How is life at Duke during the pandemic? What is the most challenging for you? How about Dr. Goatley?
I was going to yield to my colleague. Well, first of all, Wojciech, let me say thank you for the invitation, opportunity to be in conversation with you and my colleague, Edgardo. Life at Duke University during this season is like it is in many places across the country. Of course, the United States is big and complex, and so there's a large range of experiences. One is we are in a season of continual adapting to new realities and trying to make decisions that hold together issues of security for students and staff and community, for being responsible members of the community, for paying attention to issues of justice for all, particularly for those who experience systemic injustice in the United States. Racism is woven throughout the fabric of the experience, and sometimes it's more obvious, sometimes it's less obvious, sometimes it's recognized, sometimes it's denied, but it's always present. And so any decisions that are made will have different ramifications for people depending on where they are situated in terms of their social location in the United States. Mm. Right now, in terms of doing our work, most are having to work remotely. And so some were already doing some of that. I don't think anyone was doing it as much as we all are now. So we all have been on a learning curve of how to adapt to social distancing and working remotely, how to teach better and more effectively, how to create community, how to stay connected, and just how to negotiate a life when the rhythms that we normally had, the opportunities that people normally had, have been disrupted, first because of the pandemic, and then in certain places because of protests. And for those who will be viewing in your part of the world, sometimes, not sometimes, we always need to be aware that when we see news broadcasts or things on the web or even read them, often what we read are the most extreme experiences and images because the business model is how to get readership and how to get eyes on your broadcast. And so the deep experiences, the more normal experiences that people have are often not shown because of the extreme images that people can see. So for example, there are some people who think that there is a lot of violence going on, and that is not true. That's the exception. That's not the rule. And so we're having to pay attention to all of these things that are causing us to adapt to a different season that we've not been in before.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much for this perspective. Let me stay for a moment with the COVID pandemic, and we will go back to the other issues. Edgardo, what do you think? Will the world, how the world will look like afterwards? Will there be a way or going back to the previous form of existence, let's say normal life?
Well, I'm not a prophet, nor the son of a prophet, as the prophet said. So it is really a complex time we find ourselves in. And we hear a lot the word being used of a new normal. And of what that new normal means for us now in the moment that we find ourselves, and what that new normal will look like when there is, say, a vaccine or other and better testing and contact tracing, etc. And I do not know what it's going to look like. We can all say that it's going to be different, and I believe that is true, and that some of the adaptations that we're making now will become part of how we interact and work in the future and connect. But I imagine that there will be also elements of continuity as well, so that if we look at previous historical periods as points of parallel or comparison, we see that yes, there is always some continuity, some discontinuity, some practices that are not going to be, we're not going to be part of our standard going forward, but some that will resurge and that will be adopting again. And so what that looks like for our future remains to be seen, and how quickly we adapt and find our ways into a new sense of a rhythm and normality that sticks with us for some years. And no doubt, as if we look at previous historical periods of significant transitions, there will be losses and things that we're losing now that are lamentable, that are tragic, but also new things, that are new possibilities that would not have happened before. And what the exact configuration and the timing, I don't know. At the same time, I do know that the work of the church goes on, and that the gospel will continue to be witnessed to and proclaimed. What that looks like, what it looks like for us to gather and worship, and what it looks like for us to study together, that may be changing, but that would not be the first time that's happened through our history.
Yes, thank you. I think you are a type of a prophet. I'm listening to you carefully, and I think it's very prophetic. Thank you. Okay, let's go to the other issue. We are, and I have to say, with not only for me, but also for my colleagues here in Poland, we are following the news of riots and protests after the death of George Floyd, which happened May 25th in Minneapolis. And well, as you said, some of the protests, riots are peaceful, some are violent, but the scale of these protests is really overwhelming. It seems that there are millions of people on the streets, and we can hear the criticism toward the American government, but there is also lots of support for the protesters from the side of the United Nations and European Union, Amnesty International, and other organizations. And these mottos, George Floyd, or I Can't Breathe, or Black Lives Matter, they are heard everywhere, not only in the American cities like DC or New York or Minneapolis or Las Vegas, but also in London, in Brussels, in Berlin, or even in Warsaw. So if I could ask you to explain somehow the situation to Polish public, to our students, what is really going on in America?
Well, thanks for the question, and there are many perspectives. The first one that I would like to say is that the language of riot, I think, is not appropriate language. What we have are protests against violence by law enforcement against disproportionately Black and brown people, or African American and Latina, and people of color, but it's primarily Black people who are being subject to a disproportionate experience of overly aggressive, violent police action. That's what the violence is. The violence is not in a protest. The violence is when people who have a responsibility to serve and protect treat Black people and other people of color as though they're dangerous. And the facts do not support that. And so Black people some studies say, are almost 6 times more likely than white people to be shot or murdered by the police. There's no excuse for that. And it's documented that even people who have weapons, Black people have weapons less than white people have weapons. So to talk about danger, the feeling that people are endangered, is not based in the data. Now, it's based in people's imaginations because of systemic racism and because of white supremacy ideology. And what white supremacy holds is that people who are white are inherently superior than people who are not white. And so the large experience in the United States, a defining experience is anti-Black racism. So the protests is not rioting, it's protest, it's crying out for justice, because this has been a part of the American experience since before the United States was a country. And we've been calling out and asking the government in ways of regulation and legislation to stop it and to hold people accountable and to not have an environment that makes people think that it's permissible to be violent against Black citizens and that they will get away with it. And that's another problem, because most of the time, there's some data that says 99% of the time when white law enforcement murders Black people, that there is no accountability. They're not prosecuted. And so what you have, I think, is an amazing multicultural, interfaith participation in protests that are saying it is no longer acceptable to treat Black people with this kind of violence, state-supported violence. And it's just been very encouraging to see that it's intergenerational, that it's multicultural, and that it's international. And it is tragic that it took this video, very graphic video of watching somebody being murdered, unarmed citizen being murdered by law enforcement. It's tragic that it took that to get people to hear our cry and believe our testimony. That's not the first time it's happened, but it's the fact that it was captured on video. You're sitting there watching, looking into the eyes of someone whose life is being taken away. And I think that image has spoken to the deep moral and ethical fiber of many people who just trying to live their lives day by day, trying to basically treat others the way they would like to be treated. And I think that has touched something. So the protests are call for justice and a call for treating fairness and to try to eradicate this. So the very particular experience has to do with Black people and with anti-Black racism, but I think it's also a metaphor for other people who are vulnerable to abuse and violence by people in power, and they're protected by government or by the uniforms. So I think that this is speaking to both the particularity of anti-Black racism and violence against Black people and other people of color in the United States, but it also is a metaphor that speaks to other people who are vulnerable to powerful people and privileged people in the world.
Yeah, yeah.
And let me say one other thing too, that there's also a lot of evidence that the examples of property destruction, there's a significant amount of evidence, it always has and has been documented now. A lot of that are by people who come in, they're not a part of the movement, and a lot of it is either financed by or participants by people who are a part of like white supremacist groups and things like that, because the more that they can be destructive to property, they can distract the issue of justice. And so most people are peaceable, they're passionate, but they're peaceful.
Yes.
And it's a peaceful protest. And there are some examples of property damage, but we must never allow some examples and some experiences of property damage to distract us from the issue of talking about the preciousness of all life and how people deserve to be treated with fairness and equity.
Yes, thank you. You're both ordained, so I have this perhaps hard question. What is the role of the church in this context, or broader, the role of theology? How much guilty it is of the situation that is happening now, or how much helpful it is in this whole process that we are observing?
It's a wonderful question. And I think that there is certainly the need for some segments of the church in particular who have been associated with people in power who have propped up structures either by giving them a veneer of Christianity and of gospel to them, and also the membership and leadership of the church in how they have, in some cases, simply tolerated many things that should not have been tolerated. At the same time, aspects of the church and people within the church and churches have been at the forefront of protesting and of calling for a new way of life. And so there is this, it's an ambiguous witness that the church has been giving throughout the history of the United States, I would say. So it's not just now, but really throughout the history. And so I see it as that the church both has the need to repent. It is also the church has the need to witness, and that within the church we have this very mixed body, and so that at one level then it has to be very local, as to say, well, who are the people that you're leading in a congregation, and leading in discernment and hearing to the Spirit say, what is it that, how do we better understand our own story? In some cases, what are aspects of our story do we need to repent of? Where have we actually been, in some cases, faithful witnesses, but now we need to listen again to the Spirit and perhaps respond in a new way, and not simply in the same way that we've been doing before. So I see it as very much this this mixed body, and I would say that the two faces are there present throughout history. The face of the church that is seeking to be faithful to the gospel and to the witness of Jesus Christ, and the face of the church that has been turning away from that witness and embracing and witnessing for other lords and for other gods. And that's not a new development. It's certainly present, as mentioned, in the United States, in the history of this hemisphere, but might say also, of course, in the history of Christianity, that the two have been present.
Yes, yes.
And I'd like to add to that. I agree wholeheartedly with my colleague's description, and I'd like to add that I think in this particular time in the United States, where we have the manifestation of systemic racism in two particular ways. One is the pandemic and the disproportionate effect of death. In May, the end of May, there were estimates that about 24% of the deaths were from Black people, who make up just under 13% of the country. And I know in the state where we live, there were some recent reports of just incredible number of new documentation of positive tests for COVID in the Latinx community, of over like 60%, I read, of new confirmations in recently, just in the state where we live, and the population is somewhere around 13% as well. So what the pandemic is showing is it's a manifestation of a structure of racism that denies access to quality health care and quality health. The protests are, again, an expression of a historic relationship of racialized violence, state-sponsored violence against Black people and brown people as well. So what we're dealing with is the root of racism that the fruit is being manifest in this season in some unusual ways. And so a part of what I think the contemporary call is, while acknowledging this complex, ambiguous experience of people in the church being in different places, I think the call today is, how can we, as some Old Testament scholars are talking about, how can we be neighborly? The call to loving neighbor as we love ourselves. And how do we insist on justice in a way of talking about equity, so that none have too much and none have too little? And I think that that is a contemporary call today for the church. And how do we work it out at the local level? And then how do our structures and institutions lend their support so that we can make sure that we live as neighbors and that people have equity?
Yeah. There is this British organization, Oxfam, and I'm sure you're aware of them. They publish the data and they refer to equality or inequality of the world. In January 2020, just before the World Economic Forum in Davos, they announced that 1% of the richest people own more than 6.9 billion of the poorest people in the world. Or on the other hand, 2,153 billionaires own more than 60% of the whole population of the world. How would you refer to that? Do you think that this whole crisis or the situation that we are dealing with will change something, anything in this matter?
The word I would use would be scandal. It would be the first word that comes to mind to describe that tremendous gap between the concentration of wealth in the hands of so few, and that it is only increasing that concentration and going in directions that seem to defy attempts at more equitable distribution. I would say that on the one hand, it seems very difficult to see how the situation can change. On the other hand, as a Christian, I believe that there is possibility for change, that there is hope, and the possibility for a conversion to occur, and that possibility is present for us even right now, and that that there is an opportunity here, and there is nothing that has been written in heaven regarding this status as we have it right now and the inequity, and that it needs to remain so for a certain number of more decades or centuries. But an opportunity is here. Opportunities have come before and past, but also the opportunities here for us right now for a conversion and for finding new ways of living that are more equitable.
Yeah.
And I think also that I think many people would be surprised to hear that scandalous information. And I think one of the what this protests, these protests around the country and around the world have showed us is that when people are made aware of the scandalous behavior of a few, then it stirs up in them a righteous indignation. And it speaks to the hearts of people to add their voices and be advocates and move to activism to demand more justice. And I think that, one of the questions is how do we help people become aware? How do we continue to share the awareness of this scandalous information so that it can connect people across faith communities, across ethnicities, across all the boundaries that we find ourselves living behind, because that is the kind of scandalous information that continues to sentence people to premature death. Our Latin American liberationists taught us, half a century ago that this kind of abject poverty is a sentence to death prematurely, and we need to find ways of communicating that, because what the people who extract wealth from the masses do, and that's what we're talking about, an extractionary kind of economics, where they extract the resources and extract the wealth from the many and concentrate it into the hands of a few elite. So the question is, how do we make that information as clear and compelling as what we all saw with George Floyd's murder? And I think that as we are able to communicate with people that this is the fact, and then this is how it manifests itself in your life, where you can't have access to clean water, and you can't have, you live with food insecurity, and you live with vulnerability to disease. And back in the mid-90s, I was in Zimbabwe, and the guy who was my host said to me, all we want is to be able to feed and clothe and house our children and send them to school so that they have a chance at a better life. And then he said, is that asking too much? He was speaking to me as an American. And the question, is it asking too much? And I don't think it is. And I think that's what a lot of people around the world, are trying to not be excessive, but to have enough. And I think that one of that just scandalous fact that you just referred to by Oxfam that's the kind of information that we need to help people hear, and then help people to be able to tell their own stories about how this reality plays itself out in my life and in the lives of my community. And I think what we will find is that there are more people who share similar stories and similar struggles and are willing to share the load to help to make things more equitable. It won't happen overnight, but we can I think, move together in a direction to make this world more humane and more habitable for everyone.
Yes, yes, absolutely. David, I have a personal question for you. May I?
Okay.
What does it mean to you to be Afro-American Christian in the south of the States? What does it mean?
Well, I think Christianity is a source of strength and hope for me in the midst of a place where there are many who would want to deny that. Not all, as my colleague Edgardo said earlier, that in the church we have people who are on all kinds of parts of the spectrum, some noble, some horrible. But being a Christian mean, in part, it says that I am created in the image of God. Despite what anti-Black racism and white supremacy says, it's a false ideology that says that because of someone's skin color, they are inherently superior or inherently inferior. That's not what the gospel teaches. That's not what God says. And what God says is God made humanity in God's image. And we have dignity, and we have integrity, and we have possibilities beyond what we can think or imagine. So I have identity, I have dignity, I have a community. And one of the things that is important for Black Christians and Black Americans to remember is that we're not in this alone, that we are in a community of people who love God and who are empowered by the Holy Spirit to do the best they can to touch people with the transforming love of Jesus. And so I'm not in isolation, I'm not alone. No matter what the news says, no matter what somebody's marketing campaign says, no matter what somebody's political campaign says, there is a community of which I am a part across the South, across the country, across the hemisphere, and around the world, who together we are able to draw on the resources of the one who has made us and who keeps us. It also means that there's a source of strength that, particularly for Black Americans, the forward movement that we have enjoyed internally, much of that has come from the formation of the church. Peter Paris is a Afro-Canadian ethicist who used to talk about the Black church being the cultural womb of the community. That's where we learned we learned that we are someone special. No matter what others called us, we learned that we were special. We were nurtured to live into what God wants us to live. That's where we learn leadership skills. Many people learn who are artistic. They do the arts. They first learn to perform in that cultural womb that was a place of affirmation and nurture, and it prepared you to go out into a world that tried to beat you down. So we live very much in the face of systems of oppression and of wickedness in high places. But we are our journey has been a journey of resilience, a journey of imagination, a journey of adaptation, and we are not alone. And so that's how I am as a Black Christian in America.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Edgardo, I have a question to you. How does the Hispanic community see the situation? Are there similarities between Afro-American and Hispanic, well, groups, communities? How do you perceive this whole thing?
Yes. There are similarities in the stories of African Americans and Hispanic people, but there are also some differences. In the United States, the presence of Hispanic people, as we think of them now, is more recent in some areas, particularly in the East and the South. And so there's a way in which my own state, the Hispanic population grew tremendously in the late 90s and the 2000s, and it grew through immigration. And because of that, they came into a situation where they had received already negative impressions of African Americans through media, and their views in some sense were molded through the US media that presented African Americans, say, as criminals or all the stereotypes that we've been talking about. But then find themselves now in, say, a place like North Carolina, in some cases living side by side, and that has at times led to misunderstanding, but at times and also for growth in understanding and in seeing the parallels in the situations and the ways in which both African Americans and Hispanic Latino people in a place like North Carolina are subject to powers that oppress, that seek to separate, to divide in order to keep marginalized. In other parts of the country, it's a different story, where you have historic presence of Hispanic and Latino people, where there were Hispanic Latino people before there was a United States, because it was through expansion that they came into the United States. In the case of my own, now here I can talk about the backdrop behind me, Puerto Rico became part of the United States through military conquest in 1898 by invasion from the United States. And so the idea that somehow the United States has not expanded through military conquest or has not engaged in colonization, stories that sometimes people grew up with, it just doesn't make sense. All this is to say, though, that the experience of someone like me from Puerto Rico is going to be different from that of someone in different parts of the United States. Nonetheless, what we're seeing right now is this convergence, a greater awareness of a common struggle, and that our hope for a more humane, hospitable society lies in collaboration and cooperation, rather than in trying to work for our own people by ourselves to gain a little bit of a pie that we try to protect for ourselves, rather than saying, let's redivide and redistribute this whole pie. And so there is again an opportunity here for a new history, and in that sense, a new a new us that is that without abolishing differences, we abolish hostility and look for and work towards a good that is a common good that is good for all of us.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Your statement really led me to almost the last question. When preparing to this interview, I realized that the death of George Floyd was not the first one. I mean, it has happened many times before. So my question is, will it happen again? Or what can we do to prevent such horrible situations? Is there a hope for our world? How would you see that?
Well, first, it has already happened again. There was recently, a few days ago in Atlanta, Georgia, a man who had fallen asleep in his car in a restaurant parking lot. The police were called. They awakened him. I think they did, well, you know, it takes a while to get the right story with law enforcement in the United States, because that also is documented that when they have body cameras or when there are cameras on them, oftentimes the official reports they write, when you come behind it with video evidence, they have not told everything that there is to tell, or they've told it wrong. So it still is going to take some time, but they allegedly did a field sobriety test, and then there was a scuffle. Allegedly, the black guy got a hand on a taser and he started running away. And so he's running, trying to run from the police. The police have his driver's license. They have his car. He's running on foot and he gets shot in the back twice. So now there are going to be some people saying, well, he shouldn't have run. They're right. He shouldn't have run. But why do you shoot an unarmed man running away in the back? I mean, why do you do that? So this kind of overly aggressive violence is a part of our culture. Now, back in earlier in the year, that did not get much attention. It was in the spring. There was a young woman, Breonna Taylor, who in Louisville, Kentucky, the police came in to her house, broke in the door. Her boyfriend was registered to carry a firearm. He shot because he thought somebody was breaking in at night, which they were. And then they shoot guns, and she's hit 8 times and killed. So she by law enforcement, because they were looking for some evidence that someone had been dealing some drugs out of her apartment. No drugs were found, no paraphernalia were found. So here you have another case of overly aggressive policing. And here was a young woman. She was an emergency medical technician. She was trying to, get ready for nursing school, trying to be helpful, and then she's a victim. So you see, there are these stories that like to try to criminalize people who are victims. George Floyd was accused of using counterfeit money to buy something. Well, the fact that you are accused of something by a store clerk does not mean that anybody ought to come at you with that kind of violence. So is it going to happen again? Yes, it's going to happen again, because it's happened before. And that there's nothing about this protest that is going to change immediately the hearts and the minds of some law enforcement. And I say some law enforcement because we all know that all law enforcement and most law enforcement are not the kind of people who are going to aggressively come at you with deadly force. When they do, however, there's no accountability. So one of the things that is going to happen is there are going to be some who feel emboldened and feel like they have to be more aggressive. And that's going to happen, and it's going to have fatal results. But if there is a way to continue to channel this energy in some ways that call for specific restructuring, and there are some who are talking about reform, and some are talking about, deconstructing law enforcement and then reconstructing it. so that we don't put all of this money in militarizing law enforcement, but that the resources are targeted where they can do the most good. It doesn't make sense to have police officers dealing with people who have substance abuse and addiction or mental illness. They're not equipped for that. And so there is, conversation about restructuring the way that we do public safety in ways that are trying to help people who are vulnerable rather than waiting until somebody is afraid and they act out of their fear, which is what these, some law enforcement are doing. And then some are acting because of a certain kind of callousness. So unfortunately, it will happen again. However, if we can keep this momentum going across the country and around the world, we can hopefully start having different ways of providing public safety for people who have been violated in the past.
Yes. I have for you both the last question. What would be your message for our Polish public, for our students in this context? One idea that you have in mind that we could transfer to our students, please.
Well, I think that we want students to take very seriously that we are called to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. That ought to be foundational. We want students to take very seriously that what God was doing with the Hebrew people when he brought them out of Exodus was helping them to have a way of life that was, in some scholars' language, it was anti-Pharaonic. So it was not the world of Pharaoh. And that the Ten Commandments, for example, is not the way of Pharaoh. And God has a different way of ordering community. And in Jesus, we really are called to love the neighbor as ourselves. And so we need to attend to both the systems of justice so that we are not complicit with this kind of extractionary, imperialistic way of forcing the will of a few on the masses so that they can extract wealth and put people at make people vulnerable. So we need to pay attention to the systemic things, and we need to form people to treat others as we want to be treated, and to love the neighbor as we love ourselves. And so I would hope that your students can pay attention to both the personal and then the communal, as well as the institutional and national and transnational issues, so that we make this world more humane and more habitable for those who are most vulnerable.
Thank you very much. Edgardo, what would be your message?
First, I would encourage your students to see these stories that they're seeing and hearing about as also theirs in some way, because one member of the body suffers, the whole body suffers.
Yes.
And so that this is not simply something happening far away, disconnected. No, this is also, as Christians, something that should be deeply felt by us as related to our own sense of being in Christ. At the same time, I think that what is happening here could serve as a mirror in which then to look at what is happening closer to where your students are in ministry and working, in ways that we've seen happen in some protests that have led the protests in solidarity for what is happening in the United States with George Floyd has led to examination of complicity with injustices more locally, whether it be in colonialism, the role of different institutions in colonialism, or in police violence. So that kind of examination too. And then finally, I want to highlight again the scandalous nature of what is happening. It should not be. It's a scandal and a stumbling block. What is happening here, in that it should trip us up in some of the ways in which we think of what we're doing, what we're about as Christians. It should cause us to do a double take, to reflect again. There's a song, in Latin American song, that has this verse that says that there are more churches than happy children in the world. Now, that may be something of an exaggeration, but it's a call for awareness, to say, what is it that we are doing as witnesses to Jesus Christ in our communities? What kind of impact is it having? And if it doesn't seem to have an impact, if it seems that it's simply continuing some sense of normalcy or something like that, maybe this is an opportunity to be tripped up and to discover a new way of being Christian.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, it's a beautiful message and a wonderful lesson, and it has been a pleasure and honor for me to talk to you. You're wonderful people to talk to, and I would wish we could talk more. I have lots of questions, and I have learned from you a lot. Thank you very much. God bless you.
God bless you. Thank you so much.